Mr. Deputy Speaker. So this bill will apparently be the biggest shake-up to democracy since 1832. Well, in Islington, we know a few things about radicalism. We elected Tom Dunscombe as our Finsbury MP in the 1930s, but he wanted universal franchise. So he presented the Charters petition, which was signed by 3,315,752 people. Now that's radicalism, and that's what you call a real shake-up. But this bill is simply wrong. It's not radical. Given how little time I have, I want to focus in relation to this bill on just a couple of matters. And the first one is this. It ignores a whole proportion, a whole swathe of the residents of my constituency. And the second one is the issue of AV. It is estimated that there's over 77,000 adults who live in my constituency, but under this legislation, only 66,400 of them are going to count. The others are non-people. Far more of my constituents will become non-people under this legislation than, for example, in Witney, where there are approximately 82,000 adults and 78,000 of those count. I see the honourable gentleman looking confused, so let me explain. Why is there a difference? The difference is simply this. First of all is the group who don't register to vote. And according to the Electoral Commission, they are exactly the sort of people of which we have large numbers. So they are young people, half of them don't register to vote, half of private tenants don't register to vote, a third of the BME community don't register to vote. And obviously there are not that many young black private sector tenants living in Witney, nor in Maidenhead, nor in Sheffield Hallam. No wonder the rate of non-registration for inner London is 18%. And in Islington, our low registration was notorious. We reached the lowest point before the 2006 local elections when the local Lib Dem council achieved a measly response rate of 67%. When we challenged them to do a BME registration drive, the deputy leader of the council shouted across the council chamber, "That's how we win elections." Well, you can imagine there was a huge row. And to cut a long story short, as a result, in the 2010 election, there were 9,000 more voters in Islington than there had been in 2005. 60% of them voted, and guess what? 6,000 more people voted Labour in Islington. The second group of non-people that are going to be made in my constituency are those who come from outside the EU or the Commonwealth. Now, many of them are very political. In fact, they come from governments in countries where their governments believe they're far too political, which has actually resulted in why they've had to come to this country in the first place. Now, many of them would love to vote, but they're not allowed to because they're not yet British citizens. But under this legislation, they don't exist. They are non-people. And the third group is very important as well, because they can vote, they are on the electoral roll, but they don't vote in the right kind of elections. In my constituency, I have 6,500 EU voters, like Mrs Clegg, who will not count under this legislation. In my constituency, that's 8% of the adult population. Now, as an MEP, the member for Sheffield Hallam used to care about these people, but now he seems to have simply forgotten them, and now they become non-people. According to the Commons Library, over half of countries in the world count entire populations when deciding on the size of constituencies. That includes France, Italy, Portugal. And that's what we should be doing, rather than making 11,000 of my constituents non-people. If that wasn't enough reason to oppose this bill, I have another reason, which is that I'm against AV. And my reasoning is very simple. Our current system builds a direct relationship between the community and their MP. Residents come together to decide who they most want to have as their national representative. No one has more than one vote, and it has to be cast responsibly. We are all equal, and the first past the post is the one who gets elected. It's simplicity itself, and it doesn't exclude anyone because it's a complicated system or because people don't speak English as their first language. Some people scoff at the argument about complexity, but we can see from the London mayoral elections, where 5 times as many ballot papers were spoiled as in the general election, that simplicity is a very important issue when trying to include everyone. Of course, there are criticisms of the current system, but they are not going to be solved by AV. If AV was going to bring us honest politicians, I would be a proud Finsbury MP bringing another huge petition to this Parliament to introduce AV. But it doesn't do things like that, and that is why the public are supremely disinterested in AV. We should not be spending our time on this. This is a party political, this is a particular piece of legislation which is simply propping up this coalition. It is I asked myself what it would be, what Dunscombe would make of this legislation, what he would make of legislation that allows 11,000 adults in my constituency to not count at all when it comes to national policy. I am quite sure that he would be appalled that the cloak of radicalism is being used, and the great cause of electoral reform is being used to wrap around this sectarian piece of legislation. This bill is designed merely to serve the interests of the ruling parties and to help prop up this wretched coalition. It will not improve the lives of people, and I will vote against this bill, and I would use my second, third, fourth and fifth preferences to vote against it too.